There is a Greek proverb: a society grows great when old men plant trees, whose shade they know they shall never sit in. What are the greatest examples of this in human history? Kotoku Wamura, mayor of a village called Fudai, in years 1947-1987. The largest project of his many years is undoubtedly the 15-meter floodgate that can be lowered to shield the village from an incoming tsunami wave. During its construction and in the years after, it was largely regarded as excessive and too expensive, costing approximately $30 million in 2011 money. If you are puzzled why it is most commonly seen calculated for year 2011 in particular, I hurry to remind you. In 2011, eastern coast of Japan was battered by a massive tsunami. Villages and towns all over were destroyed, with many of their inhabitants dead or missing. Fudai was the only village that stood almost completely untouched thanks to the once controversial floodgate, 27 years after its construction and 14 years after the death of Kotoku Wamura. He corrected the height. I got the numbers and units mixed up when reading up on the floodgate. It's 51 feet or 155 meters, not 51 meters. Wamura died in 1997 at age 88. At his retirement, Wamura stood before village employees to bid farewell. Even if you encounter opposition, have conviction and finish what you start. In the end, people will understand. One of the best quotes came to comment saying, "Attempts." W spokesman, Stories 2011 May 15th. Belittled floodgate saved. Joseph Bazalgette was a Victorian engineer who masterminded London's modern sewer system in the 1860s. He foresaw the insane population growth, and when all the calculations were made on how big to bore the pipes underground, he essentially said, "Nah, let's double it." Now, infrastructure that would have been unable to cope in the 1960s is still in use today. Yeah, he also insisted on the use of Portland cement, which was much more durable. That said, it still just dumped the effluent into the river, turning it toxic. Several people died from ingesting the dirty water while trying to escape a sinking ship in the Princess Alice accident. But you really appreciate the better sewers when you visit other cities that weren't so lucky to have such a visionary engineer, and you can smell the sewers on the street as they weren't dug as deep. And Dubai was like, actually, we can just get slaves from Pakistan and India and make them truck our shit away, and we won't need pipes or storage tanks or none of that new-timey bullshit. Nothing works better than an old-fashioned Hungary, isolated, contractually obligated slave. That's the entire country, not just Dubai. 90% of their population is foreign. They have almost no domestic manufacturing, and almost all of the fancy projects they keep showing off are designed by foreign engineers and then contracted to slave labor to build. Dubai is essentially just a pop-up city in the middle of nowhere. Dubai is essentially just a pop-up city in the middle of nowhere. I feel like Dubai has no culture. It's all about rich handbags, fancy cars, and towering skylines. It's empty vapidness, almost like a mirage in the desert. A factoid I like about this guy is that one of his descendants is in some capacity part of the executive for the TV production company Endemol, responsible for a good portion of the reality TV output of the early 2010s. So while his ancestor removed effluent from people's homes, the descendant is busily pumping it back in. Don't know if it's true or not, but it's a good story. Japanese people aged 60 or older volunteered to fix problems in the Fukushima nuclear power plant, knowing that they would probably die of natural causes before the radiation damaged them in the long run. I don't know if they actually did it though. They did. The radiation around the plant wasn't high enough to result in sickness, but it was still a possibility they had to be made aware of, and it is still a noble thing they did, knowing that information. I was hoping I'd see this near the top. Basically, every nuclear plant worker who stays after the meltdown anywhere is planting trees for the future. During the Napoleonic Wars, there was a Royal Navy admiral who, when on leave, used to wander his country estate planting oak trees to provide timber for the Navy. It's estimated they are about ready now. Sweden did something similar, and then the Office of Forestry informed the Navy that their oaks are ready now, in 1975. If I remember correctly, the story goes that the warden of the forest that took care of the oaks at Visingsö called the royal court to tell the king that the trees are ready. Eventually, he was put off and allowed to talk to the king. The king found it very amusing and invited the warden to the royal palace for dinner and drinks. Edit. After a quick Google, my story does not seem to be accurate, and the op is correct in that the marine was informed, not the king. However, as I was told the king's story on a school trip to Grana, Great Polka Candy, and for sing so, I choose to believe it anyway. In the same way, Notre Dame de Paris is being rebuilt with oaks from the French strategic reserves, which were planted for the same reasons, to provide quality wood for the Navy. The US Navy still maintains an oak forest to provide timber for a ship in their fleet. Pretty sure the US Constitution is currently the only active ship in the US fleet to have a ship-to-ship victory. Yes, the Constitution is currently the only active duty vessel in the US Navy to have sunk an enemy vessel in combat, making it by that definition the deadliest ship in the US Navy. Don't say it so loud, Napoleon will hear. A lot of the examples in this thread are ones I've heard before, though they're still great. One I don't see mentioned often is the written Korean language, Hangul. One dude, King Sejong, basically sat down and created a whole alphabet so people wouldn't have to continue using the adopted Chinese Hanja that were complicated and difficult to learn. His goal was to increase literacy among all levels of society, not just the wealthy elite who had the time and resources to learn Hanja. It received a lot of pushback from the wealth elites, of course, but following the end of Japanese colonialism in the early 20th century, it gained popularity and is now the official written language in both North and South Korea. I was stationed in Korea for a year. It's a phonetic alphabet, easy to learn. I still have my old hand-made flashcards around here somewhere. Dashrath Manji, also known as Mountain Man, was an Indian laborer from Gela village near Gaya in the state of Bihar. When his wife died in 1959 due to injury caused by falling from a mountain and due to the same mountain blocking easy access to a nearby hospital in time, he decided to carve a 110-meter long, 365 and 9.1 meter wide, 35 wide path and 7.7 meter deep using only a hammer and a chisel by himself. After 22 years of work, Dashrath shortened travel between the Atri and Waziganji blocks of Gaya district from 34 mile to 9 mile. He said, "When I started hammering the hill, people called me a lunatic, but that steeled my resolve." Though mocked for his efforts, Manji's work has made life easier for people of the Gela village. William Wilberforce. He campaigned in the British government for over 40 years to stop and prevent slavery. He was successful in abolishing the trading of slaves throughout the empire with the Slave Trade Act of 1807 and then the ownership of slaves altogether with the Slavery Abolition Act 1833. He died 3 days after hearing the Abolition Act had passed in Parliament, after a lifetime of campaigning for it. He is buried in Westminster Abbey, which is reserved for monarchs and national figures of significance. His campaign for abolition was the blueprint that other abolitionists, like Lincoln, soon followed up with. There are many generations living because of this man's choices. Edit. And if his good karma wasn't already high enough, he was also a founding member of the Royal Society of Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, RESCA. I, 37M, came across Wilberforce's biography as a 21-year-old. I don't think any other biography had a greater impression on me than his. At 25, I took my little sister on a little tour through Western Europe, and Canadian too, and one of our first stops was Westminster Abbey. Yeah, that was definitely a very special moment in my life, finally meeting the man I admired possibly more than anyone in history. Great comment, A Killing Joke 90. 6. Cheers to you. The Voyager spacecraft. One of them is the only object that's left the solar system. They're still sending back data, and they're each carrying a gold record encoded with information, our planet's greeting card to the cosmos. It's hard to overstate how much that project changed humanity's knowledge of the solar system. The Voyager probes were crucial to discovering volcanoes on Jupiter's moon Io, the first volcanic activity confirmed outside of Earth. Before the Voyager mission, Earth-based telescopes thought there were only a handful of rings around Saturn. Voyager found thousands of rings there, found thin ring systems around 2 other outer planets, found dozens of moons, and more other information than one comment can do justice to. NASA is still planning future missions based on information the Voyager spacecraft discovered. If alien life gets discovered on Europa or Titan, you can thank the Voyager engineers and scientists. Most of them could have earned far more money in the private sector. Being part of this effort was their dream job. And they won't see this work through to the end. They can't. Voyager began the planning stages 50 years ago. Human lives just aren't long enough, and they knew it. Edit, there's a fully functional third Voyager craft that was never launched. NASA built it and kept it on Earth for engineers to use in troubleshooting if the two Voyager probes in outer space ever ran into unexpected problems. That third Voyager craft spends most of the time on display at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory facility in California in the Von Karman Auditorium. Every year in the month of June, JPL conducts tours open to the public. For security reasons, they can't let a whole lot of people on site, but the tour itself is free. Applications opened on April 3. JPL is usually described as in Pasadena, but it's actually in the smaller nearby city of La Canada Flintry. If you can snag a ticket, you'll spend part of the tour face-to-face with that third Voyager craft, and you might also get to see JPL's moon rock. OTPS, UWWJ, Double NASA GovEvent Stores View. Most of NASA's missions could fall into this category, whether it's Earth sensing, interplanetary exploration, or cosmic observation. We literally don't know what we will find. We're just spending money for the advancement of gestures, broadly knowledge of the things around us. A specific example might be the hole in the ozone layer. We didn't know it existed. We didn't know it would matter, but we found it as part of a general mapping program. Turns out it was a big deal, and the knowledge we had allowed us to identify and stop doing the things that were destroying it. The Cassini family map, a first-of-its-kind map of France. It took 4 generations of family members and 6 decades to complete. Imagine being that second family member. Your whole life, your father works on this map, only for you to work your whole life on it while raising your son to do the same. And it takes a whole another life for it to be complete. Imagine being that second family member. Your whole life, your father works on this map, only for you to work your whole life on it while raising your son to do the same. And it takes a whole another life for it to be completed. Reminds me of Cologne Cathedral that took 600 years to build. Admittedly, they took a 300-year lunch break in the middle, with a crane being parked on top of the building for 400 years. Imagine your family going 20 generations and not seeing the start or the end of the project. Imagine being the first generation to go back and finding initials carved into the wood for a family member you'll never knew existed. The world's oldest privately owned business was the Congo Gumi Construction Company, founded in 578 AD. The family specialized in bamboo construction of shrines and temples around Japan. That company had been owned by a single family for over a millennium. Imagine being the failure who had to sell it in 2006 because they ran it into the ground. Imagine being the failure who had to sell it in 2006 because they ran it into the ground. Holy shit. Maybe their Excel spreadsheet simply ran out of columns. Children who deviate from the cause are going to be whipped so hard. I'll bet they have a multi-generational belt. That tends to be the case with any tradition. If you leave, the efforts of your predecessors were for nothing. Hence the belt. In a very literal sense, the landscape gardens of capability, Brown. He carefully crafted these gardens, directing the planting of trees and bushes to create a beautiful vista where it would take decades for the plants to actually grow to fulfill his vision. Bloody stupid Johnson. Norway's sovereign wealth fund, that generation could have taken a selfish view and just taken the cash, or politicians just gone on a vote buying spree, but it's independently invested and managed for the benefit of future generations. Australia and our mines. So much money given to billionaires to keep our jobs. That's an example of old men cutting down the trees planted by previous generations to make their own house bigger while leaving everyone else with no shade to sit in. Not just billionaires, multinational companies receive huge tax subsidies to keep operating. Seriously, if they are not competitive without subsidies, then let them fail and nationalize the fallout. Haha, once the mines are uneconomic for the firms, they'll just cook the local subsidiary company to death, and you'll be nationalizing the fallout anyway. Waiting for Rio Tinto and Sumitomo to pull this shit with the toxic waste at Tuwai Point aluminium smelter in Nanze after milking subsidies from taxpayers for decades and accounting all the profits out of Nanze so they pay duck all tax. In Canada, we had a province that came so close to setting themselves up like Norway, but then they looted it for lower taxes. It's kinda sad. Cries in Albertan. For those who are curious, the Heritage Trust Fund, the Iraqi who saved Norway from oil toll. an Iraqi geologist and former high-ranking employee of the Iraq Petroleum Company, who'd recently married a Norwegian woman and moved to Norway, walked into the Norwegian ministry and asked if they happened to know of any jobs for someone in the petroleum sector, just as some oil companies were starting to do exploratory drilling. A few years later, he was instrumental in creating the framework that gave the Norwegian state a large share of the oil company's profits and laid the groundwork for the sovereign wealth fund. The UK literally did the latter. They got access to North Sea oil at the same time and used it to fund tax cuts, whilst claiming financial success courtesy of trickle-down economics. Today, our taxes are still lower than in the 70s. The oil money has fallen off, our social infrastructure is underfunded, and the rich are still rich. King Afonso I of Portugal started the plantation of pine in Leiria in the 13th century, which is now known as the Pinhal de Leiria, with the intent of stopping the advancement of sand dunes. It was then expanded to its current size by King Dinis between 1279 and 1325, and it's said that every time they cut trees, they would plant some more, so it would never disappear. Besides this great role in stopping the dunes, and thus protecting the agricultural areas, the Pinhal de Leiria area is most known for supplying the wood used in the ships during the Portuguese discovery period, which ushered the country into its greatest period of prosperity. It may have not been planted with that objective, but the kings that did it over many decades did it knowing that they wouldn't get many benefits in their lifetime, and it coincidentally ended up being of great importance centuries later. And in 2017, 86% of it was burned down in forest fires, and because our government is incompetent, it is basically all destroyed still, with less than 50% of the burned area being replanted, and most of it being replanted, and most of it being replanted by the normal plant growth that happens, not by any government. Action, action. Story started off so strong, then took a turn. You basically just made a summary of the story of Portugal. Cries in Albertan. My favorite is easily the tree root bridges in Meghalaya. Meghalaya has a monsoon season where they get the vast majority of their annual rainfall, so the many small streams turn into impassable raging rivers. In order to get around, they developed a method of making very strong bridges by stringing the roots of the trees so that they grow across the chasms. This was obviously a slow process that would take several generations of caring for the trees to complete. In the end, after passing the knowledge and responsibility down to their children and their children's children, they would have a strong bridge that could last hundreds of years. Roosevelt and national parks. If he never did what he did, there wouldn't be any today. Corporate greed would have wiped it all out. Even on a smaller scale, people who had the foresight when suburban expansion was happening to set aside some land. I live in a nicey suburb, and my town is blessed with a huge, relative to the town size, public park that has a public pool, a lake for swimming and fishing, a freshwater spring, hiking trails, picnic areas, open fields, and athletic field. It is open not only to the residents of the town, but to surrounding towns as well. It is a gem that benefits all the area residents. We have this only because one man, just one man, saw the need to preserve open space in the face of suburban sprawl in the late 60s, early 70s. He donated some of his own land and then appealed to the state and federal governments to purchase the adjacent plots to preserve the land for future generations. He was successful, and the park is named after him. Had he not done that land would have just been another 10 single-family home subdivisions by the time the 80s rolled around. My kids, not even born until 30 years later, have enjoyed this park their entire life. Edit. Lots of great guesses, none correct though, and I'm gonna keep you guessing. It warms my heart to know that other awesome people took this same initiative in different areas. John D. Rockefeller Jr. was also instrumental in helping preserve our national parks, despite being born a child of that corporate greed. He poured vast resources into buying up land to hand over to the government for preservation. Public infrastructure. People got to live to see the opening of one rail line or bridge, or several, but the integrated network of public infrastructure that took 100 years to grow and is still growing. Similarly, the U.S. National Parks system. A great decision was made to invest in preservation decades ago, and we have been enjoying the benefits since. Thank you, Theodore Roosevelt. Mabel Ping Hua Lee was a suffragette, but because she was not a US citizen, she knew that even if she succeeded, she would still not be able to vote. The giant cathedrals in Europe like Notre Dame would take over 100 years to build, so the person who started building it would work their whole life on it and know they wouldn't be alive to see it complete. I've recently been to Cologne's cathedral. They started building it in 1248. They stopped unfinished in 1560. Then halfway through the 1800s they started building it again, finishing it in 1818, finishing it in 1880. Not only the original builders would not see it finished, but neither would their grandchildren. The huge cathedral in Florence took more than 180 years to build. It was sitting there without the final biggest dome for like 30 years, because they couldn't figure out how to make the hexagonal dome stable enough to support itself. So the guy that started it didn't even intend to see it finished, but he also gave the younglings a challenge to complete in a better time. Next time I hand over my shitty half-finished code at work, reflect on the cathedral in Florence, little one. I had that sense awakened when I visited La Sagrada Familia a few years ago. We hope to return there when it is actually completed, but to see the massive effort over several generations to see an idea through was part of the amazing experience there. Everyone that took their polio vaccine, you never get your childhood back, and none of those kids that suffered from polio will either. I had that sense awakened when I visited La Sagrada Familia a few years ago. We hope to return there when it is actually completed, but to see the massive effort over several generations to see an idea through was part of the amazing experience there. Insulin patent was sold for $1. We managed to fuck that one up. But it counts as planting the trees, even if we're too stupid to sit under the shade. That's not a Greek proverb. It's the invention of a 20th century Quaker writer whose creation was appropriated in the 1990s by politicians in the United States Congress. They added the byline, Greek proverb, to make themselves seem more intelligent. That's not a Greek proverb. Greek proverb. As a Greek, I was wondering why I've never heard this Greek proverb. Edit. I'm aware I won't know every proverb, but the more popular ones tend to stick around, are used and heard. As a Greek, I was wondering why I've never heard this Greek proverb. Greek proverb. Any scientific research that seems like a total waste of time and money right now, like the space race, medicines, nuclear fusion, etc. Some people might say we should just focus on improving morality and social justice, which is important, don't get me wrong, but let's be real. Humans are dumb as rocks, and we're always screwing things up. So I'm hoping that eventually we'll come up with some quick fixes that keep us from wiping ourselves out as a species. A great example is Joseph von Fraunhofer. Primarily a designer and creator of optical equipment, in 1814 he tested a new diffraction grating to separate sunlight into its constituent colors, i.e., the rainbow, and observed large numbers of dark lines scattered throughout. Without knowing what they were, or if they meant anything at all, he catalogued and described them in painstaking detail. Today they're still known as Fraunhofer lines. It was almost 20 years after Fraunhofer's death that his lines were found to be the signatures of the sun's and other stars' chemical makeup and physical characteristics, resulting in major advances in astronomy. Joseph Bazalgette, the man who designed London sewers in the 1860s, said, "Well, we're only going to do this once, and there's always the unforeseen, and doubled the pipe diameter. If we had not done this, it would have overflowed in the 1960s. A great example is Joseph von Fraunhofer. Primarily a designer and creator of optical equipment, in 1814 he tested a new diffraction grating to separate sunlight into its constituent colors, i.e., the rainbow, and observed large numbers of dark lines scattered throughout. Without knowing what they were, or if they meant anything at all, he catalogued and described them in painstaking detail. Today, they are still known as Fraunhofer lines. It was almost 20 years after Fraunhofer's death that his lines were found to be the signatures of the sun's and other stars' chemical makeup and physical characteristics, resulting in major advances in astronomy. Susan B. Anthony spent her entire life trying to get women the vote. She was fined for attempting to vote and spent years organizing people to fight for the cause. She died in 1906, a decade before the 19th Amendment was ratified. If there is an afterlife, she definitely feels the appreciation of society still. Her grave is constantly visited and decorated with e-voted stickers. to the point that the cemetery covered her gravestone in a protective case so the adhesive would stop degrading the stone. Still relatively early compared to parts of Europe, though source. Introduction of women's suffrage, 1906 Finland, 1913 Norway, 1915 Denmark, Iceland 1918 Germany, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Luxembourg, Austria, Poland, Russia 1919 Netherlands, 1920 Czechoslovakia, 1920 Wild in 21 Sweden 1922, Ireland 1920, Great Britain, 1946 Italy, Romania 1947, Malta 1948, Belgium 1952, Greece 1971, Switzerland 1974, Portugal 1974, Portugal 1984, Liechtenstein, Switzerland was the late example I knew about, though I thought they were 1984. I think you meant Sophie B. Hawkins. I think I will organize a dance. My friend's wife, an organic sheaf and farmer, got cancer and died in the prime of life, leaving behind a grieving widower with a preschool child. As she lay dying, she got up and planted the next crop of vegetables, which she knew would not be harvested by her. Her memorial was held in a big greenhouse on the cooperative farm. People shared foods made from her recipes with her vegetables. She literally lived this proverb. Neil Bevan, created the niches in 1948, died in 1960. Absolute legend. Sadly, his legacy has been slashed to tatters and continues to take damage. He resigned after modest fees for dental services were introduced. I can hardly imagine how angry he would be at the current state of the dental. Teeth are not luxury bones, nor eyes extraneous organs, head to toe, or it isn't healthcare. Mendel discovered, literally, the seeds of the hereditary system in the mid-19th century. But if I recall well, nobody took it seriously until the early 20th century, like 30 years after his death. The civil rights movement. Milk knew he wouldn't be alive to see integration. True. It's clear he knew this and nonetheless persisted. The day before he was assassinated, he gave his "I've been to the mountaintop" speech and said, "But I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord." Teb's Twitter, Combinise King Statuson Quintillion, 319 quadrillion, 150 trillion, 430 billion, 941 million, 741 million, 704,304. Such idiot blows my mind, how he knew. It's the most powerful speech I've ever seen. The amount of emotion confide in his words. It's be very time. I don't believe in a God, but he really makes me believe he saw that promised land. Makes me believe we can get there as a people, if not as individual. I just visited the museum at the hotel where he was shot. If you read anything about the civil rights movement or just being black in the South, back then it's pretty fucking obvious that everyone in that movement was walking round with a target on their back all the damn time. The number of beatings and murders the civil rights movement was subjected to is just mind-blowing. And you know there's so many more that are lost to history, were never reported. The FBI was actively trying to neutralize him. He knew he had a target on his back. That said, I don't know that he knew it was that impending. The old Japanese people who volunteered to clean up nuclear waste sites from the Wii bombings. They knew that they likely wouldn't live long enough to suffer the worst of the effects of radiation, so they did it to protect younger people from experiencing it and to clean up Japan for future generations. It's really heartwarming. They did the same thing after Fukushima. I'm old and will die before the radioactivity kills me, so I will go rescue them. It's great that they did that, especially because after I read this question, I immediately thought of the firefighters in Chernobyl. They went into the reactor to prevent the disaster from escalating further, saving lives. They probably didn't know their heroic act would cut their life short. I am fairly certain that the Chernobyl heroes would have known that diving into a nuclear reactor for a while would kill them, but did so nonetheless. They did a great service to humanity at the cost of their lives. They definitely knew. There are accounts of them discussing exposure and how long they could stay in before dying. This is also a common urban myth, maybe from leaning too much on the dramatized series as a source of information. The 3 divers lived pretty well, and one died of natural causes in just 2005. The other 2 were working within the industry as 2015 Keps W History Company article, the story of the Chernobyl divers. This is blatantly misleading, a bit far from the reality. You probably mixed two events. The World War IT bombings of Hiroshima were the first of their kind, and nobody knew of the effects of radiation from bombs yet. At AF Nuclear Museum, Orgafistry Atomic Veterans, 1946. 1962. Text some percent, 20%, 20%, 20%, 20%, 20 atomic cities, percent, 20%, 20%, 20%, 20%, 20%, 20 bombing. You are probably mixing up the cleanup workers from the Fukushima reactor meltdown after the tsunami on 2011. Those volunteers were indeed knowing perfectly the risk and still did it anyway. I'm more interested to know when and why so many old people stopped planting and caring about the trees to begin with. It's not as shady these days as the shade they enjoyed in their youth from their elders. Ita, you'll know I'm not really talking about trees, right? I'm sure there are more splendid examples, but for me it's every single act of kindness we do without expecting something in return. Every time we make someone feel good, or we act honorable even when we know it won't really benefit us. The best things in the world doesn't always come from famous men doing great things. It just as often comes from the millions and millions of people living their lives doing small acts of kindness and empathy in their everyday life. That is how we inspire others to do the same, and I guess that isn't as grand as planting a whole tree, but maybe it's like being one of the grass straws that makes the ground softer to walk on. Bridges. You didn't do anything to earn that bridge. You didn't ask for it, pay for it, or build it yourself. You came into existence with a convenient way to cross natural barriers that would otherwise be massive detours to travel. Most of Jimmy Carter's actions